Right, I'll start the process going. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. I'm very pleased to have Rob Dean giving us this talk about the Kennet Avon Canal Trust. Rob Dean has been the chairman of the Kennet Avon Canal Trust, but he's now the main activities on the Kennet Avon is in fact looking after the boats, and Rob will tell you all about this. This is the last talk in our present series. As I said before, this is we've had an experimental series of talks, which I think has been worth going through and trying. What we're going to do now is have a break for the summer. We were going to do a talk session in May, but we decided that's probably a little bit late in the season. So we'll start again sometime in September, hopefully. So a bit of housekeeping. If you want to ask a question, there's the chats box at the bottom right-hand corner. If you use that, I'll see the chat from the Google Meet, and I think Martin will be doing the chat from YouTube, so you can ask questions using the chat function. Okay, now to the business. Just the Kennet Avon restoration scheme. This was the first major restoration scheme in the country. What was interesting, the last passage on the old canal through the Kennet Avon was in 1951. Then the early 50s, a group supporting restoration was set up. 1956, clause in the British Transport Commission's Act wanted to remove the right of navigation between Bath and Reading. So in 1956, there was a petition signed by 22,000 people taken along the canal where possible and was presented to the Queen. And this really started the long campaign to restore the canal. So that's getting on to 70 years ago. So in 1960s, 1970s, there was various restoration projects. 1990, the canal was officially opened by the Queen, but it wasn't fully restored. Full restoration occurred after the 1996, wherein a £25 million Heritage Lottery Fund grant towards the total cost of £29 million was obtained. And the restoration was led by our own John Laverick. Anyway, that's just a brief introduction to the Kennet Avon. One major advantage of the Kennet Avon over the Wilton Barks is that there was one landowner. The Wilton Barks got this added complication of multiple landowners. Anyway, Rob, over to you, and cheers.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John, for inviting me and for that introduction. You promised not to give my talk in the introduction, but I'll tear up half of it now. And great delight to be talking to fellow members of the Wilton Barks Canal Trust. And I just want to talk tonight a little bit about the K&A restoration from a viewpoint looking back, if you like, 32 years. But just for lovely to see so many people here, and I think there's a few on YouTube as well. So thanks very much for coming to listen to me tonight. As well as thanking John, I want to thank Martin, who's helping us with the tech. I am in fact coming to you from a boat in France. I'm currently moored in the town of Aire-sur-le-Lys on my boat. So we were a little bit nervous about whether the tech would work from here, but so far so good. But let's just hope it carries on. For those that don't know me, my name's Rob Dean. I'm a former diplomat, and I've been, as John said, chairman of the K&A Trust for 6 years. and I'm now honoured to be president. I'm also a boat trainer. That's my real passion. I'm a boat skipper, and it's fair to say I'm probably an all-round canal nerd. In the winter, I'm training on boats in the UK, and in the summer, I'm messing around on boats over here in France. And the only thing I enjoy more than using the K&A is talking about it. I've been boating all my life, mostly on the lumpy water around the coast, and I've been on the canal for about 18 years. I fell in love with the K&A and got involved with the K&A Trust, which has been great. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the history of the canal and the restoration, because I reckon a lot of you will know most of that. But rather, in the next 45 minutes or so, I want to try and answer three questions. Was it all worth it? Does the canal matter much today? And why is the K&A Canal Trust still here? What are we for? And of course, I'll be delighted to answer any other questions you might have. Um, the difference doing it online to doing it in front of a room is I kind of don't get any feedback. So I should be delighted for you to make comments and questions, as John said, through the chat boxes, and John and Martin will feed those back to me. Right. Okay. So let's just look at the Kennet Avon, a slide that many of you may well know. It's big for a start. It cuts a swathe right across southern England, and by joining the Thames there at Reading on your right, it joins London to Bristol, and we'll see why that mattered when it was built. It involves some challenging engineering in joining two rivers together and climbing more than 500 feet above sea level as it passes over the Marlborough Downs. Now, some of my focus here is on Newbury. That's partly because I originally wrote this talk for an organisation in Newbury, but also because Newbury is quite important as a waterways town, and I think it's important to think about that. And if you're thinking about towns that can be waterways towns, I always say Swindon, come and take a look at Newbury and see what a waterways town can be like. Um, and Newbury has been at the centre of the K&A right from 1723 until today, nearly 300 years. And of course, Newbury is both a river town, being at the head of the Kenneth Navigation, and a canal town, being at the start of the canal proper. And much of its prosperity is due to the waterway. And today, the canal brings visitors to the town and also provides a wonderful place of relaxation for people who live there. Now, let's go back to 1715 when they kicked it all off with a legal process. Back in the 18th century, Acts of Parliament were the only planning application process that existed. But they were also important because canal builders often had to force landowners to part with land for the canal, and that took Parliament's power. John mentioned the number of landowners you have for the Wilts and Berks. I guess you'd quite like an Act of Parliament as well, really. But this was what was created in 1715. The good news was the existence of the Acts of Parliament made it much harder for 20th century governments to close canals without getting the backing of Parliament. And we all know how much governments rely on Parliament, don't we? The whole business of putting Newbury on the waterways map, of course, wasn't popular with some. The evil residents of Reading saw themselves as the inland port for Berkshire. And at one stage, the building works were vandalised by a riotous mob led by the Mayor of Reading. I have pointed this out to several recent mayors of Reading. Here's what is now Newbury Wharf Car Park, which was the head of the navigation then, built with warehouses for transshipment, some of which now form the museum and some form our little cafe there. Um, and the warehouses would have been there for loading stuff on and off of boats. And of course, there was a basin into what is now the car park. I think there would have been many jobs created at Newbury, loading and unloading barges. And the chance to move goods was a boost for businesses in Newbury and for the farmers around it. And new, cheaper goods would have arrived for the residents of the town. It certainly would have been a significant economic shift in those days. So the Kenneth Navigation opened by 1723, just 8 years after the Act of Parliament. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? The river had been shortened by dug canal stretches, and they built some big locks, 110 feet by 18 feet. We'll see why in a minute. They were made on the cheap. They had turf sides. There was plenty of water being on a river, so they didn't have to worry too much about it. And the underlying ground was pretty poor. This is Monkey Marsh Lock at Thatchem. It's the only original restoration, and it is a national monument. Here's the boat it was built for, a Newbury barge. Sadly, there's none of these left, but we could perhaps build a full-scale model to put on the wharf come the day when they do away with the car park there, which has been talked about. Um, and as you see here on the slide, these amazing things had a capacity of 128 tons. Now, the biggest lorries allowed on Britain's roads today carry or have a gross weight of 43 tons. So these boats were carrying more than twice the size of a current articulated lorry back in 1723. And I think it's worth considering for a moment what the economic impact of that would have been, that they could bring these boats up from Reading to Newbury. There were no decent roads then, but suddenly they could move goods in a couple of days, and it was incredibly efficient and cheap. I don't think the sails would have been used much. I think it would have been mostly hauled, and probably mostly hauled by gangs of men rather than a horse. Gangs of men in those days being cheaper than horses. So the Kennet was pretty successful for about 60 years. But by 1790, there was pressure to build right across the country to open up trade. You had two important ports, London and Bristol, arguably the two most important ports in the world at that time. And there was a need to transfer goods between the two of them. It was a long and hazardous sea journey. Well, why? Well, there's two obvious reasons why it was a hazardous sea journey. Land's End and the southwest coast, the graveyard of many boats. Seagoing boats had to be smaller or need more crew. And of course, we were at war with the French, and French privateers made the English Channel a risky place for cargo. So in some ways, we can thank this chap on the right, Monsieur Bonaparte, for being a driver for the canal. But the French would also have a role in its demise, as we'll see a little later. So here's what they built the canal for, the K&A, the Kennet barge. And this is a barge called Unity at Honey Street. And a replica of Unity was built a few years ago, and I think is still on the canal. It was 70 foot by 14 foot, the new K&A lock size, bigger than most of the canals in England at that time. It was an open boat, it was horse drawn, carried a mere 60 tons, but that was 60 times a cart of the day, and still 1.5 times the biggest lorry on our roads today. And it had 1 horsepower. So by connecting the Thames at Reading, the K&A created a goods route right across southern England, connecting the ports of London and Bristol. possibly the most important ports in the world at that time. The journey is 167 miles, and it would take about 11 days now, but the working boats might have done it in 6. The K&A carried a very wide range of goods, but probably more heavy loads of raw material than finished goods. In its heyday in the 1840s, it carried around 350,000 tons a year. That's about 15,000 modern lorry loads. Coal from the Somerset coalfields, iron ore on its way to the ironworks at Seend, lots of timber moving along the canal, fertiliser for the farms of Wiltshire and Berkshire, grain to the watermills of the Kennet, and flour back from them, raw materials and finished products for the brass mills on the Avon, materials for the Stotherton Pit crane works at Bath, Bath stone for George in England, plasticine from the Harbert's factory near Bath, and the oddest one that I've read about, 2,000 leeches from a London supplier to a doctor in Bath. Here's a crosscut for those who remember their school geography lessons, showing the profile of the canal. It had a great big climb up from Reading, up over the Marlborough Downs, all the way along the Vale of Pewsey, what we call now the Long Pound, and a sharp drop down from Devizes. By building a tunnel at the top, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, I suspect not. By building a tunnel at the top, that saved another 12 locks. But also the original idea for the tunnel was it was going to be 3 miles long. And that was eventually replaced by the Crofton Fight and the pump. I'll come back to that. So water needed to be pumped up to operate this. It was pumped up at Crofton, right up there at the summit, by steam and by water wheel at Claverton, towards the left of the picture. There were some big engineering challenges in this, especially along the steep Avon Valley to Bath. The canal crosses the Avon twice, at Avencliff and Dundas, and John Rennie created a beautiful aqueduct at Dundas. John Rennie, the canal engineer, of course, had originally been a bridge engineer. He made the London Bridge, the one we sold to the Americans, and looks terribly like, if you look at a picture of it, looks terribly like Dundas Aqueduct. And the canal clings to the valley sides that goes along there, and that created a big restoration challenge. Quite a lot of the £25 million that John mentioned earlier went on restoring that valley side, putting concrete basins in there. And you can see just in this picture, it connects to the Somerset Coal Canal, of which there's just a quarter of a mile left for moorings and a visitor centre. Now, in 1841, along came the son of another Frenchman, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. It's amazing what refugees can achieve, isn't it? And he built the Great Western Railway. He built it at an incredible pace. The canal craze was quickly supplanted by the rail craze. And suddenly there was a rail covering the whole of the length of the K&A that could move people and goods a great deal quicker. And this triggered a slow decline. So in 1851, it was almost exactly 100 years. In 1851, the Great Western bought the canal, and they put the prices up to drive freight onto its trains. They cut back on the maintenance, and in 1877, a loss of £1,920 was made, and the canal never made a profit again. There was an attempt by GWR to legally close it in 1926, but that failed. Thanks for that, Act of Parliament. And again, as John mentioned earlier, in 1951, the last passage through the canal was by the narrowboat Queen. But the canal did work through that 100 years. It was a slow, stately decline. There was much local trade still, if not the long distance trade. The canal was important during the Second World War as part of the GHQ Blue Line defence. Um, we never needed to test its success as a defence, but it certainly was successful moving goods. The Germans didn't really think to bomb the canals. But in 1951, that was the last time a proper boat could get through. And the collapse into ruin was rapid. Canals that are not looked after and maintained properly certainly start to fall apart. Here's Widmead at Thatchem with rotten lock gates. The British Waterways Board had been formed in 1948 at the nationalisation of the railways, and the possibly apocryphal story goes that the Ministry of Transport had been rather shocked to learn that it got the canals as well at nationalisation. Not sure that's true, but it's a great story. Here are other canal locks collapsing and rotten. Canals that are not used weed up quickly, and they're not even good for the anglers. Anglers and fish and boaters tend to grumble at each other these days, but that canal there is not much good for an angler. Here's the Bath flight. The pumps have been stopped. There was no maintenance, and it fell into rapid decay. Cane Hill flight rotted beyond most people's hope of repair. Except, of course, not this guy, who was one of a number of heroes, as I like to call them. Our hero here, John Gould, MBE. He was a Newbury trader, a boat operator, a passionate believer in the Kennet Avon, an all-round awkward bugger and eccentric. All those all-round awkward buggers and eccentrics were damned important to the restoration of the Kennet Avon. So then started, after the Great Decline, what I like to call the Great Miracle from the 1950s to the 1990s. First of all, there were legal steps taken to prevent closure. There was the petition to the Queen that John mentioned. A petition to the Queen these days doesn't sound terribly powerful and exciting, but I think back in the 50s it was pretty important, and it kind of unnerved the government somewhat. There was the formation originally of the Kennet Avon Canal Society, and then it became formally a trust, a charity in 1962. So we're celebrating 60 years today, or this year rather. British Waterways had to be persuaded. We started off in very active conflict with British Waterways, but gradually brought them round. It involved thousands of volunteers and millions of hours. I know these days we're all quite good at counting the hours, but nobody bothered back then. But millions of people, thousands of people made it their free time hobby to work on the canal. Fundraising, everything from making cakes through to writing applications for major funding. And it involves some major engineering as well as people getting muddy. It involves some major engineering which had to be paid for. And the canal finally became navigable throughout on the 17th of July 1990, so 32 years ago. Simple repair wasn't always possible because of road building. Here's the Bath flight. It had to be remodeled and then dug back out. Bath had got an awful lot of rubble from air raids in the war, and they'd found somewhere good to put it all, so that had to be removed. Getting folks afloat, won friends for the canal. We still do this with 4 big passenger boats. And of course, the Wilts and Berks, I see Chris, you're there. You still do this as well. Winning friends is important. This was our paddle steamer, Limply Stoke, and delighted to see boat crews wore clean white shirts and peak caps in those days. We all tend to wear sweatshirts these days, but there we go. But I just love the image on the right. Who had a little pushchair like that? Wonderful. It was a mix of willing volunteers getting down and dirty, and some heavy duty work by contractors. Under a lot of our locks and other structures, there's an awful lot of reinforced concrete, lots of concrete. Some locks were restored close to original specifications. Others were completely remodeled. Much of it, of course, is listed, and that creates challenges. I'd like to say the challenges back in the 70s and 80s were not quite as daunting as they can be today. Very often we find ourselves completely stopped by fears about listing, and that's a bit daft, really. But of course, this is probably our most favourite photograph in the trust, even though we've got British Waterways shown at the top there. It's politics for you folks. So 35 years after the Queen accepting the petition, the work had paid off and the canal reopened for through navigation from Reading to Bristol in August 1990 after more than 30 years of lobbying, fundraising, digging, building. It was the greatest triumph thus far of the waterway restoration movement, and we were delighted that Her Majesty the Queen came to Devizes to reopen the canal. The canal was navigable, but fragile. It took another 12 years and the biggest ever then lottery fund grant to complete the restoration. And even then, there's some bits that could do with some more restoration. But the K&A was fully open for business and a shining example of what the community can achieve. A fantastic playground for generations to come. Well, now the challenge. The restoration pioneers, glad to see we've got one or two here tonight, are a rapidly diminishing band of heroes. They dedicated huge amounts of time and effort to the restoration. 32 years on, would they still think it worthwhile? And how should the community feel about it? Should Newbury be proud to be a waterways town? Well, here's the Newbury Waterways Festival, an annual event that's been missing for the last couple of years for reasons you'll understand, but we'll be back this year. And there's the duck race, which is always very popular. So I can answer my own question in two ways. Let's start with the numbers. Since the restoration, we've done some studies with professional help, the impact and use of the canal in economic terms. That was last formally updated in 2010, when the study showed that the canal supported over 1,300 jobs. Visitors to the canal spent £42 million a year, with a total economic impact of £55 million. Sounds a lot? Well, there were 11.2 million visits a year. Now, that sounds like a crowded place, but actually, as our American friends would say, do the math. We have 87 miles of the Kennet Avon, so that figure means on average 352 visits per mile per day. So we can keep 11 million people happy and still have a beautiful, peaceful place. Oh, and by the way, the study reckoned that the presence of a restored canal added £150 million to house values. But of course, the restoration pioneers didn't do it to drive house prices up. The pioneers wanted to preserve the incredible heritage of a waterway right across southern England, relying on incredible engineering marvels such as the Crofton beam engines and the mighty Dundas aqueduct. The pioneers wanted to protect a wonderfully diverse waterway filled with natural beauty that was threatened by the unstoppable wave of building of roads, houses, and shopping malls in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they wanted somewhere where those 11.2 million visits could be really relaxing and enjoyable, whether it be walking, cycling, fishing, canoeing, or otherwise mucking about in boats. Because as our dear friend Ratty said, there's nothing more worthwhile than simply messing around in boats. Standing at West Mills in Newbury on almost any day of the year, I think it's safe to say that our pioneers would think their efforts well worth it. I certainly do. But they were the enthusiasts. Perhaps we're the enthusiasts. Does it matter much to the community? Excuse me, just gonna turn the light on. There we go. Help. um, we all have so much to concern us in these uncertain times, and the pressures on young and working age people seem greater than ever. The figures I quoted show that the canal is well used, has a great economic impact, and preserves an important part of our heritage. But we can go further than that. The canal is important to more than just boaters, anglers, and history nerds. The towpath has become a vital cycle route into our towns. That's important as people want to get fitter and reduce their impact on the environment. Important as the roads get busier. I wouldn't want to commute to work by weaving my way through the queue of cars heading into Newbury and belching diesel fumes, but I'll happily weave my way around the puddles on the towpath and breathe cleaner air. The towpath is full of joggers too. Some marketing twit called it an outdoor gym or the Natural Health Service. Groan. An increasing number of youth groups are using the canal for canoeing and other activities. Several community boat projects use boats to get through to excluded young people. And the K&A has a long heritage of getting disabled and elderly people afloat. We play a major role in that, which I'll come back to shortly. And let's not forget our heritage of elite sport. Every Easter since 1948, elite paddlers from the UK and overseas descend on the K&A, sorry, for a grueling 125-mile and 77 portages race to Westminster. It's one of the canoeing world's most important races and attracts the very best athletes. Courtesy of Trust member Stuart Fisher, who I see is here tonight, here's a happy picture of two of this year's class winners from our very own Devizes Canoe Club. Now that's a club that's gone from strength to strength in the last decade and really does great things for young people. But for those of us less athletic, the canal is an amazing place to just slow down. We spend a lot of time telling boaters and cyclists to do just that. Life on the canal proceeds at a slower pace. Hop on the M4 in Reading and you can be in Bristol in an hour. On the canal, it's going to take best part of a week, even if you rush. And it's so much better if you don't. People behave better too. I run a test with passengers on the trip boat at Newbury. I invite them to wave at passers-by on the towpath, crossing Newbury Bridge or at the lock. Everyone waves back. I then suggest they walk up Northbrook Street, Newbury's High Street. Do the same and see what reaction they get. It's what I call the canal effect. Running right across southern England, straight through Reading, alongside Thatchem, through Newbury, Hungerford, Great Bedwin, Pewsey, Devizes, Hilperton, Bradford-on-Avon, Bath and Bristol. The canal is close to where more than 2 million people live. It's a different place that takes us back to a world where people lived at a more measured pace and were more civilized to each other. But that doesn't have to be a rose-tinted piece of nostalgia. It really is the way we can live in the future. I firmly believe that the canal is more important to the community in 2022 than the restoration pioneers could ever have imagined. Which brings me to my last question. The Kennet Avon Canal Trust was formed in 1962, 60 years ago. The canal opened in 1990 and the restoration was finally completed in 2003. So nearly 20 years later, why haven't we all packed up and gone boating? Well, the restoration is never quite complete. There's always more to do, and restored canals don't stay that way unless they're looked after. Of course, we in the K&A Trust don't directly maintain the canal. That's the role of Canal and River Trust, a charity since 2012, 10 years now. That remains largely government funded, although I worry about the next few years of that. And the CRT has the statutory responsibility to maintain most of the nation's waterways. And we continue to work in partnership with CRT. Their development of volunteer support has been especially successful on the K&A because of our heritage of volunteering. Plenty of our members could be seen on towpath maintenance wearing a CRT jacket. I'm very happy with that. Our strapline now is that we protect, enhance, and promote the canal. We're the only organisation that represents the canal itself. If the canal had a voice, we're it, and we're keen to be engaged with our community to ensure we can do that. We're very much a federal organisation. We do our work through 8 branches at Reading, Newbury, Hungerford, Bedwin, Crofton, Devizes, Bradford, and Bath and Bristol. We now have 3 cafes, 4 passenger boats that carry more than 22,000 passengers a year, a community boat for young people, a popular museum, an archive, a visitor centre, and the world's oldest steam engine still doing its original job. We run several major events each summer, and since the restoration, we've expanded. For many years, we were good friends with the Bruce Trust, an amazing charity that built 4 purpose-built boats, especially equipped for disabled people. Over the past 30 years, more than 20,000 disabled, elderly, or disadvantaged people and their families have enjoyed a holiday on the Kennet Avon. In 2016, we took over their fleet to run it in perpetuity. So now, with 9 boats on the canal carrying people who might not otherwise get a chance to get afloat, I think we're the largest boat operating charity in the UK. So, having worked so hard to restore the canal, we're now working just as hard to help the community enjoy it. And of course, that's not just my opinion. In 2013, we received royal recognition through the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service for leadership of the restoration of the canal and its buildings over the past half century, and for creating a landscape and amenity valued by the whole community. And we're doing our best to continue that leadership today. And I think Wilson Barks also holds the Queen's Award, and I think that's really important. And I think for those of us that do hold the Queen's Award, we need to dig it out every so often, give it a polish and wave it at everybody and remind ourselves of the fantastic things that we're doing. I've mentioned steam engines once or twice. The canal ran through the Savernake Forest south of Marlborough because John Rennie met up with James Watt and they decided they could use a newfangled beam engine to lift water the final 46 feet to allow the canal to cross the hills. The pumping station is still there, and whilst boring electric pumps lift the water most days, on 20 or so days a year, we run up our 2 steam engines and the mighty beams rock up and down, lifting more than a ton of water at each stroke. It's an amazing sight and a world-class asset, with our Boulton and Watt 1812 engine being the oldest engine in the world, still doing its original job in its original location. This Grade 1 listed site needs a lot of caring for, and we need to ensure it's here for the future. We've recently completed a project costing £845,000 to carry out major restoration and improvement of the buildings and visitor facilities. This was helped by a grant of £559,000 from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Securing that was no mean feat, and it's an important recognition of our ability as a charity to deliver what they call people outcomes, using heritage and the environment to improve lives. How do we do this? Well, the simple and complete answer is volunteer power. We have around 400 amazing dedicated volunteers who do everything from repairing those 200-year-old steam engines to professionally managing and skippering our passenger boats. To do all this safely and effectively, we need great management, training, and health and safety systems. That nearly all comes from our volunteers, and I'm constantly on the lookout for skilled new volunteers, and I'm regularly amazed at what they achieve. So what are our big challenges? Well, we're focusing on three things at the moment. There's always restoration and repair works needed. The boiler here at Crofton needs new rivets again, and that's been done this winter. And we're fundraising to ensure that we can keep Crofton in steam. We're also looking to restore a small but interesting old building at Altermaster, known as the Wash House. That's going to be expensive. And we need to decide whether we can keep our headquarters, a museum in Devizes, running. We need to rebuild our earning capability after the pandemic. We lost around £200,000 over the past 2 years through Crofton having to close and for being unable to run boat trips for much of the time. And in our 60th year, we need to attract new generations of volunteers. Ewan here is a glowing example of a young professional who's passionate about Crofton. But to be honest, there's rather more like Dave in the background there than Ewan in the foreground. Having restored the canal, we need to inspire the next generation. As I mentioned earlier, the Canal and River Trust is a charity with the statutory responsibility and government funding to look after most of the nation's waterways. They're good friends and we work well together in a sort of America and Canada way, but they are a national charity and we are focused exclusively on the K&A. That means we have to challenge them sometimes. Finally, we're on a talent hunt. We need several dedicated people to join our team of trustees, people with good management and business skills in the working world, and most importantly, great people skills. The canal has been a great asset to the community for these past 32 years. Our job is to help ensure it continues to develop as an asset, not just for the next 32 years, but well beyond. I firmly believe the restoration has been good for our heritage, our environment, our community, and our well-being. Keeping these things in balance will always be a challenge, but we're up for that. We owe the dedicated pioneers who worked to restore the canal no less. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks very much, Rob. That was a very inspiring talk. There's a lot there to learn from the Kennet Avon for the Wilton Barks Canal restoration scheme, I think. I've got a couple of points.
John, what I was going to suggest is, as an experiment, if I could allow people actually to join with video and sound, and maybe if the people are interested, they could actually ask their own questions as an experiment.
Okay, well, I've got.
People can now.
I've got four comments here. Chris Barry's got three.
Chris can actually ask his own question now if he wants to.
He's got a comment.
Hello, Chris. Nice to see you.
And you. Do you remember the fire in the galley a few years ago? But don't talk.
Yeah, I've stopped doing that.
Yeah.
it only upset people.
I think my main question was I know you've got back pumping at Cane Hill Flight, and we're obviously in our planning looking at this kind of thing. I'm trying to find out what it costs.
I'm not going to pretend I know. I know the cost
An
is
email will be fine.
I know the cost is significantly offset by the big solar farm at the
Yes.
bottom that was put in some considerable years ago, slightly ahead of the time. So that has had a significant effect. Plus the way that they contract with energy providers, which allows energy providers to turn the pumps off at times of peak demand and turn them on again at low demand. The simple answer to that is to get in touch with Mark Evans, who's the regional director, and ask him that question.
Okay.
I don't believe it's a particularly significant cost, he said dangerously, although I suspect it's getting more so with energy prices.
Yeah, 'cause I'm sure you realize we have a major issue with water supply, as our new summit section is going to be higher than Coat Water, which was the original reservoir for the summit section.
Yes, they've stolen Coat Water as your water supply, which is pretty rotten, really.
Well, not just that, but we're building higher.
Yep, that's going to be a challenge. Yeah.
I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, I think, Chris, I think there's a couple of questions, a couple of points you made. One was that it makes the WBCT isn't quite as insanely ambitious. I thought that was quite a good quote. And this one is for you, Rob. Chris says this is the best talk ever.
Thank you.
With apologies to John.
That's fine. Martin Hollis has got a question. Martin, do you want to talk?
He's always asking me questions.
Hello, Rob.
Hello, Martin.
I don't know if you can see us.
I can see you. You're sort of behind my camera, but I can vaguely see you. Hello, Liz.
Hi.
Excellent. Fascinating talk. My question is, arguably, the K&A is now being too successful with too many boats on many stretches. And are there any lessons that the Wilkes and Barks should learn from this?
I think the answer to that's got to be yes. I think it's important that you do try and learn the lessons of us, but also other canals. You know, it was always a given with the K&A that the Navigation Authority was going to be British Waterways, or CRT, as is now. I think that's less obviously true for the Wilkes and Barks. But I would caution you about going down the way of the Basingstoke Canal, which suffers enormously. But I think what's really important is to recognise that canals are built for a very broad range of users. And it's not even just boats. And when you start saying, oh, it's all about boats only, and then it suddenly becomes about, and that suddenly that people that live on boats are more boaters than people who hire a boat for 2 weeks for their summer holiday, you start to get a canal class system that is just very undesirable. And I think particularly the western end of the K&A, which has got to be some of the most beautiful waterways in the world, to be honest, it just needs a recognition that there's a lot more to it than creating cheap accommodation for people. And that's not to be anti-liveaboard, but it just all needs to be managed. And when you get people lobbying for, oh, you've got to cut hire boats down, well, actually, hire boats are part of the economic package. You know, nobody goes around France, where I am, saying, gosh, we've got to reduce the number of tourists here. You know, they're desperate to get tourists back. You wouldn't believe how pleased people are to see us. And I think there's a lesson there. CRT, I mean, they're hampered with legislation that they inherited, but they have the problem that they are unable to ration access to the waterway. You know, a lot of people would say, gosh, you've got to be able to say, no, we're not going to license any more broad beam liveaboard boats. And CRT, with good reason, are saying, well, we can't do that. And I think one of the lessons I would say for the Wilkes and Barks is trying to make sure from the start you build in the ability to stop that happening. And for anybody that says to me that can't be done, the example I will give you is the River Way, which is owned and operated by the National Trust. We have a family narrowboat on the River Way, and they simply do not allow liveaboard boating. And they have the advantage that they control the lock at the end of it. And when you appear on the Riverway, if you're not a boater with a mooring on the Riverway, they want to know who you are and where you're going. And they are really quite demanding. But that's the culture. So nobody attempts to live on the Riverway. Or if they do, they soon get shooed off. And I think what we've got to do with the K&A is make sure that use by one group doesn't undermine use by others. It's really important.
Thank you, Rob.
And opening up the west end of the Wilson Barks to the west end of the K&A would be very helpful for decreasing the number of boats on the K&A.
It would be wonderful, but make sure you don't suddenly turn it into a handy arm where everybody thinks they can come and moor and live.
Well, yeah, that's another problem. But
it needs managing.
It'd be quite nice to be at that stage, wouldn't it?
Well, it would. And maybe what you should build into it, I'm inventing here now, is that you build some moorings and marina space for people to live on. So you don't have this constant battle of trying to make people shuffle every 2 weeks, but you do have a limited number of moorings that people can pay a decent income to the waterway to live on.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Right, the next question is from Joanna. Joanna Hartle, you want to talk about disability boats? Or Joanna, would you like to unmute? Oh.
I'd love to talk about disability boats.
Well, she'd like to know more about disabled boats, boat rides, etc. Can you say anything about that?
Well, we do that in 2 ways. 2 of our big passenger boats are wheelchair accessible. Oh, she says she cannot unmute. Is she not? I leave that to Richard to sort out the techie of that. But we have 2 of our passenger boats, Rose of Hungerford, you'll guess where that is, and the Barbara Mac down at Bradford on Avon. Both have wheelchair lifts and crews trained to support wheelchair users. We put a lot of effort into training crews to support that. But more importantly, we have the Bruce boats at Great Bedwin, which, as well as providing family holidays for families with disabled members, will run day trips. And if you take a peek at their website, bruce.k.trust.org.uk, I'm impressed that I can remember that, they will list some of these opportunities for getting either groups of disabled people or individual disabled people out on trips. And the Bruce boats are particularly well equipped. They can get disabled users on with large wheelchair lifts. They also have bathrooms that are wheelchair accessible and beds that are wheelchair accessible. Really quite amazing what the team there achieves. Fantastic team there. Chris, you know all about the Bruce boats, of course.
I do indeed. And just for Wilson Barks, of course, 2 of our 3 trip boats have wheelchair access.
Yeah.
All small, of course.
Yeah. But I think it's one of the incredible things we do is get people afloat like that. And it's something we're incredibly proud of and incredibly worth doing.
Okay. Hopefully that gives Joanna some more questions.
She's being asked if she can be unmuted. Can anybody help her unmute? I don't know. I wouldn't know where to begin, to be honest.
I'm afraid Martin says he can't unmute her. All right, you can only do that yourself, Joanna.
So no, sorry. Apologies, Joanna. We'd love to have heard from you.
There's a question while seeing if Joanna can do that. I think Martin can talk to her. Nigel Leake wants a question about the lift bridge at Altermaster.
Oh yes, I saw that come up and written. Who operates it? My understanding is it's owned and operated by West Berks Council. It's the one bridge on the waterway that CRT doesn't run. Having said that, West Berks Council, of course, do nothing other than pay the bills for it. Oh, hello, Joanna. We'll hear from you in a minute. They pay the bills and they employ contractors to repair the bridge and the traffic lights separately. One of my odd K&A experiences was turning up to find the bridge not working and calling out the bridge contractor, who then said, oh no, it's the traffic light contractor, who then had to come, who then replaced a light bulb and then had to call back the first contractor in order to reset the bridge. And I waited 4 hours for the one changing one light bulb, but there we go. Joanna, can you, we can't see you, but I think perhaps we can hear you now.
Yeah, great. I just wanted you to repeat the name of the email address for bruce.k.
Well, it's not an email address, it's a web address, bruce.katrust.org.uk. And that will either give you the information you want or put you in touch with the team down there. Martin Ruback is the branch chairman down there, and they can talk to you about the sort of things that they can do to help whatever needs you've got.
So bruce.ka trust.org.uk.
That's the one.
And where are their headquarters based?
They're based in, well, they're headquartered with us at Devices, but they're based in Great Bedwin is where they operate from.
Where's Great Bedwin? Is that anywhere near Devices?
Great Bedwin is south of Marlborough.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
So there's Martin's put the web address up on the chat,
which is slightly different from the one I gave you, but
oh, okay.
But I'm sure they both work actually, but
no, they do both work. It's just that the one maps into the other one. That's all. So you can forget the boats bit at the beginning if you want to.
Okay, I think any questions from YouTube, Martin?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay, I think, thank you again, Rob.
I just, if I may, just like to make a comment rather than a question.
Hello, Mike.
When the bid was being prepared, we did the estimates for the traffic and what would happen and such like, and we were told we were being far too optimistic. We in fact reached the targets in 18 months after the completion. We were all wildly wrong, and the amount of traffic on the canal now is far way beyond anything I ever thought we'd get. And I must say, I don't like all the houseboats, but we had troubles even, immediately after the opening. It's very, very difficult to control.
It is.
On the Wilton Barks, it's going to be a bit more difficult because the Wilton Barks never had any motorised traffic on it. So most of the banks are sloping and not suitable access for mooring. So we've got a slight advantage there if we keep it. But if once that's, well, of course, there's the Cotswolds Canal coming along. I mean, once that comes along, that will take a lot of traffic away from the K&A, I think.
But I suspect the traffic will continue to increase. I think you're absolutely right, Mike. You provide a good facility and people take it up. Funnily enough, I was grumbling about this point to my French teacher just today. I was talking about how busy and well used the English canals are. I've been cruising on the French canals. We're on the Dunkirk Liaison Canal. I've been cruising for a week now, during which time we've seen one other pleasure boat. and the French are heading for a disaster. They're going to lose these wonderful canals, but there we go. The French don't seem to go boating.
I spent 17 odd years on the French canals, and they were bucking up and getting quite busy, particularly the Nivernais.
Yeah, well, they seem to be dying at the moment. They really do.
Which is a great pity because they're lovely canals.
Wonderful, yeah, absolutely wonderful. Yeah.
But all the lock keepers go for lunch.
That's not strictly true. I mean, it kind of is true, but that's one of the wonderful things about France is that what they do, they force everybody to live at a civilized pace. You know, they don't all take a lunch break and rush around the shops like an idiot. They take a lunch break and go and have lunch. You know?
Yeah, and have a glass of wine or two.
And it's just about living life in a more civilized way. You know, yes, quite, Chris. I'm not sure why I'm not drinking wine. I'm in France, and you've got me there. And ridiculous, really. All I'm headed for is my cocoa, given the time here.
Anyway, I think any more questions from anybody or comments? No. Anyway, Robert, thank you very much for the talk. That was really very inspiring. And
Thank you.
I wouldn't be surprised if you were asked again to do one or two odd things for the Welcome Bark Canal Trust. I think maybe we ought to have him on our boat, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we? So many thanks again. Most interesting, that's from Liz or from Martin. Anyway, I think we'll end the proceedings. Hopefully we'll start again these online chats in the autumn. I think it's worth trying, and I think it's been a reasonable success. Okay.
Yes.
Good. Well, thanks everybody for coming to listen to me.
Thanks everybody for attending.